Hello, Matt.
Hey, Jesse. I have so many empty boxes. I have to box my house up because I got a 60-day notice to move out of my house.
Jesus Christ. Why is that happening?
Yep. So I have these empty boxes, the whims of land barons.
Yep. Get out of my house.
I need to exterminate you out of my head. You're an idea that should be long gone.
That is right. We need to exterminate these ideas. And that's why we should not save that to the end. Like the typical formation of these kinds of things, these kinds of discussions, at least as far as they are published widely, is to spend 99% of the time on critique. And then at the end, maybe leave a little bit open towards possibilities for change. But in contrast to that paradigm, I'd like to start in this conversation where we're going to dive into talking about housing, a big topic, so big that we had to break it up into a couple episodes here from what I had originally intended. But keeping with talking about geography and the right to the city, and talk about a central part of that conception of the city, that of housing. So in contrast to that typical paradigm of spending all of our time talking about the corpse, diagramming and mapping this dystopia that we live in, we should put our ideas for transformation, how the world could be different, up front so that we know what we're aiming towards.
Well, I would just want to update you to say that your comments about this being a dystopia is a little out of date. That's George Bush era. We're now in the pre-apocalypse. So I hate to remind you we're out of the George Bush years.
Maybe you need to humor me and do some clarification. What is the distinction between dystopia and pre-apocalypse? Professor Snyder.
Well, it's when your society's actually breaking down. A dystopia is authoritarian and hierarchical and full of cruelties, but it's not where the structure of society is actually collapsing. So it's like organ failure.
We are beyond dystopia?
Yeah, dystopia is just like a rash on your skin. Pre-apocalypse is like where you got kidney disease.
So we are in the abyss now, huh?
Well, not the abyss. We're just in that part where you're staring over it.
Oh, staring over the abyss. Okay.
Exactly. So that's what pre-apocalypse is to me. It's when you have organ damage. It's no longer just a rash on your skin or a fever. It's now like attacking your organs. And that's what climate change is.
Okay, well, fuck this abyss. What's something better? You got something better? Or is this the only way things happen?
Social ecology.
Okay.
Post-scarcity housing. Yeah.
Okay.
Housing for everyone.
Okay. that sounds
free housing
utopian.
for everyone. How? Okay. I'll say free again. Okay. Get my Bernie buttons going.
Once more, no surprise, anyone who's listened to these conversations before, the central idea here we'll bring up and ring that bell again and again. It's the golden square. So what is the alternative to this hellscape, this pre-apocalypse, this staring into the abyss, is a socialist world. What's the alternative to capitalism? Socialism. And how do we envision and conceptualize socialism? We use the shorthand, the golden square. We insist should be a new social contract, what should be a new common sense animating and organizing our world. This should be a starting point, this idea of what we're striving for, but it's also a goal. We start with the idea of what we want to achieve, and it is the thing that we're aiming towards. It's not the horizon of changes. We actually want to aim for a world beyond just meeting these minimums of decency and dignity, but we've first got to turn around from staring into the abyss. And so we want to look towards a reality of a world where everyone, every single human being on the planet has food, shelter, healthcare, and education guaranteed from cradle to grave as universal, unconditional human rights.
Yep.
These four things we make manifest the golden rule in the material world with the golden square.
And if you think of the 20th century, it's really organized by the failure of utopianists and socialists to do socialism from above. And we're saying in the 21st century, let's take another swing at the bat a second time around.
Yeah.
And this time try to do socialism from below, right?
Let's do socialism from socialism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I
think do socialism from democracy, goddammit.
Yes, democratize every aspect of our life. Stop pretending that your voting is the high watermark of democracy. That is the most symbolic and the most limiting in terms of trajectories for transformation. We have to actually root ourselves in our local communities and think about creating these paradigm shifts through active engagement to what's right in front of us.
Yes. So the Golden Square is our shared conception of this socialist transitional phase that we want to fight for together collectively as a shared humanity on this planet.
And it's inclusive because we fundamentally want to make sure that we decommodify these things. So we don't have to entirely agree with everyone in our coalition so long as it's towards the trajectory of decommodification.
Yes. Yeah. So long as it's towards providing material conditions where we can meet this basic level of provision to everyone on the planet, universally and unconditionally. So in this conception, we identify and use the terms food, shelter, healthcare, and education specifically. And in previous conversations, we talked about how we use each of these terms specifically in an expansive way. So we think of them as referring to and encapsulating all of the other attendant material needs. So food, when we say food, we mean clean air and clean water and all the other things that go into our bodies to keep us nourished. We say shelter. Yes, we mean housing. We're going to talk about housing, and that is the big core thing there. But shelter also means everything else that we produce together to shelter us from conditions on this planet. So clothing and housing, of course, but also infrastructure and sanitation and public utilities and transportation and safety services and so forth and so on. So when we say the right to shelter, we're talking about the right to all of the material needs for physical protection and comfort in life.
Absolutely.
So many of these things beyond housing, like sanitation and public utilities and roads and bridges and those sorts of things, we already think of as or conceive of them as public goods, even though they're largely privatized in this.
And outsourced onto the taxpayer to pay for.
Yeah. We nonetheless, because of their very nature, because of the necessary shape of them, they are used collectively. So we think of them more as public things. And the assertion we want to make is that housing must also be conceived of as a public good. And these things should be human rights, should be a no-brainer human rights. So shelter, the human right, it also means housing is a human right. And we should acknowledge that housing is a human right because it is a core necessity of living. Everyone needs a place to live.
These 4 steps, food, shelter, healthcare, and education, are designed to the degree at which you're likely to die. And that's important to think about, is why we're using the term shelter, that it's because it's a right that we should fight for, and that we shouldn't let the right, neo-Nazis and Mad Max parades of hooligans, co-opt rights-based frameworks. Because there's something powerful of what happens when a politician or an activist or an organizer yells the phrase rights. Rights is powerful as a mantra and as a coda to a new beginning. And that's something we have to think about. Is Bernie Sanders' campaign for president in 2016 and 2020, the biggest, most exciting applauses when he was using the phrases, the right to this, the right to that. Let's not lose that energy.
Yes, we should have the rights to all of this.
Because you deserve it, goddammit.
Yes. And these things, specifically in this order: food, then shelter, then healthcare, and then education. Like you said, Matt, these things are in priority order of how urgent they are to keep someone alive. These should be human rights because they are all necessities for a dignified life. Everyone needs these things. And housing, certainly everyone needs a place to live. And this should be obvious and undeniable.
Common sense dictates this, right? This is the median point for a dignified society, and the degree at which we accomplish the task of the Golden Square is the point at which we move from extinction and death towards human flourishing. So it's a minimum social program. Now, for many people, especially in the global South, this feels like a maximum global program if you actually got it, because you've never ever had it, and very few people get it. But it should be viewed as a minimum social program.
Yes. And the notion of housing specifically as a human right is not new or novel. I struggle to even see that as an idea, really, per se, because it is certainly not a matter of belief. It is just plainly a fundamental reality. People need homes. There is no debate here. There should be no debate here. This should just be obvious and undeniable.
And the statistic holds even from Occupy days. We said there were many banners and memes during Occupy Riverside, Occupy Wall Street days. It was that there were 6 empty homes for every homeless person. Mm-hmm. So this is not a resource issue. We already live in post-scarcity when it comes to resources.
Yes.
We just fuck it up by how we deploy the resources, how we create false scarcity in commodified markets.
Yeah, because it's more important to be famous, I guess. And while it is all too common to hear acknowledgments to some degree about the right to housing, typically we hear them just communicated in vague but toothless virtue signaling. We've seen it even recently, even Joe Biden has said that housing is a right. He's mentioned this when they talked about the new COVID stimulus bill.
But it remains toothless because he says it's a right, but he doesn't want to actually cancel any of the rent debt. And, it just kicks the can. Don't do anything really to actually transform that right into actuality.
And this has unfortunately been the reality in part, or part of how there has been a problematizing of the notion of human rights, because for a long time now, this has been acknowledged formally as a right, as a human right, but nothing has been done about it. As far back as the famous 1944 State of the Union address by FDR, where he proposed a so-called Second Bill of Rights. It included an acknowledgement of housing as a right, that every American deserved a decent home. That idea was formalized in the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights in Article 25, includes the right to adequate housing. And also even in the following year, in 1949, in the U.S. Housing Act, it put forward the goal
as a national objective.
As a national objective to have a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family. There are close to 70 countries that actually have some form of this acknowledgement of housing as a right in their constitutions. So it's actually a widely held acknowledgement.
And it's a reason to actually fight for it as a rights-based framework, because just because bad faith actors symbolically say these are rights and don't fulfill them doesn't mean that it's too problematic to keep a rights-based framework. It's like, no, you actually call their bluff.
Yeah. It points to the differences between when we say common sense. On the one hand, there is a real world common sense, that is human beings living together common sense, that when you talk to people, as I have many experiences in my life, yes, we know this is, but there's a common sense of like, yes, we know this ought to be, this is the way it ought to be. But then there's the common sense of, well, this is the way the world actually works. Mm-hmm. The quote unquote way the real world works, this imposed scarcity. So most of us know this, but powers that be do nothing about it. And so we just continue to live in a world that fails to meet this right. But despite all this, there should be nothing vague whatsoever about the proclamation and the assertion and the recognition, really, that housing is a human right. Because when we identify that a material need is a human right, like housing, that ought to mean, that needs to mean that it must never be a commodity.
Yeah. So we already have the language being used, we have the rights, and we have this movement away from commodity. And the problem is, the reason why the symbols can never be enacted is because of this commodity worship, right?
Yeah.
And we have to actually flip the script on that and reverse the enclosure movement that's now multiple centuries in and say, well, the reason why you haven't been able to live up to this 69 countries of the earth is because of your economic framework, right?
Yeah. The logics of the market, or logics created to manifest inequality, to enforce myths about hierarchy. They are not laws of nature. They are not laws of physics. They are not the way that the world has to be. We can make the world different. And so when we say housing is a right, it has to mean that granting that right requires providing free housing. Not merely opportunity, access, or affordability, these axes of entering the market, not some fair play on the field of the marketplace. There should be no fucking marketplace. for housing.
There's no negotiating table here, right? That's the main thing. There's no negotiating table. You start from making it available and then you figure out how to pay for it later. And this is always what ends up happening with taxation. We spend first and tax later, right? Yeah. So if you want to come up with a way to pay for it, worry about it after you have provided it. Yeah. If we have giant, drone campaigns, we certainly are using resources that never get questioned for how they're paid for. They just get paid for. Military spending gets paid for. It's never debated. Yeah. No one ever says how it's going to be paid for.
We hear often housing is a right. Housing is a human right. So whether it is activists, comrades, or even just this long history of acknowledgement by the state
and the liberal class
of this fundamental reality that housing is and ought to be a right. What I want to draw attention to is that in this moment, especially staring into the abyss and trying to turn away from it, we ought to clarify this. We ought to be overt about this, that when we say it is a right, we really mean that free housing is a right. Fully decommodified housing is a right. Housing outside of any marketplace is a right. When we understand it in this way, that a right to housing ought to be free housing for all, unconditionally, we should therefore understand that there should be no such thing as a housing market. How are we okay with that at all?
Yeah,
that there's such thing as a housing market?
Absolutely.
That should just make your head explode. And thusly, we should understand that rent of any sort, rent or mortgage, right, is a human rights abuse. Mm-hmm. If housing is a human right and housing is a human right means that housing must be free to all, then rent is a human rights abuse and landlords are human rights violators. Full stop. So why are we allowing them to continue to do this? It's just unbelievable.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. In that way, we should see that free housing for all must be recognized as a non-negotiable bare minimum of basic human decency. And free housing for all must be an overt and urgent goal in any organizing for change.
Absolutely. It's just why have this conversation? But yet we have to frame it this way because it's thought of as gravity. Like this world of scarcity is just part of the gravity of an inescapable truth that this will always be a problem. We can't solve it, but we clearly can. And we'll be talking about it for this episode and our next episode, that there are clearly solutions and there are clearly ways of organizing society that goes beyond bad faith actors.
Beyond just scarcity or not, the idea of housing as a commodity, as a thing that you have to buy. Unfortunately, there is so little discourse anywhere, even on the left, even the so-called socialist left, that really seriously puts forward this reality, understanding that housing must not be a commodity. And acknowledges in any way the degree to which this is totally fucking absurd.
Well, and it also speaks to the power of a hierarchy that we don't talk about because we often talk about race or class or gender, but that the hierarchy formation of the rise of agricultural societies with property at the center of its fulcrum.
Yeah.
And that's a hierarchy in itself, right? Yep. And if we're going to look at the idea of the subversion of the human by the property commodity is one of the great subversions of capitalism, feudalism, and early agricultural societies had formed. Yep. And so we have to move back to that trace line where property wasn't a concept.
Yeah.
Can we have all the things we have now, but without property?
Yeah.
That's the great question.
Yeah. And so thinking about this problem, specifically around the consideration of housing as a right and how our conception of human rights has been problematized. There's a good discussion of this in the book we're going to draw on probably a few times throughout this discussion, the book In Defense of Housing by David Madden and Peter Marcuse, in which they talk about these bad ideas about human rights and draw upon the conception of the right to the city, which is something we've talked about in a series of conversations here. So they talk about, rather than this conventional notion of a right, they talk about a radical right to housing or a real right to housing and draw a parallel to Henri Lefebvre's conception of the right to the city as not just a conception of a right in the conventional legal sense, but as a ethical and political sense about social struggle, about a broad political goal. They say a real right to housing needs to take the form of an ongoing effort to democratize and decommodify housing, and that a real right to housing requires fundamental change in the political and economic structures of contemporary society. And unfortunately, even though it is something that we see as an obvious and undeniable need, and we have the practical means to do that, it's just a matter of a bad idea in the way, this idea of private property. But in order to get there, in order to get to a world where this is a reality, that housing is not a commodity, it's going to require revolutionary change, transformation of all of society.
Absolutely.
Right? That's why we always
chipping away.
come back to everything must change.
A chipping away. If we can give people what they think they deserve, but do it in a way that decommodifies, then we can actually attack the central Pandora's box that is property. It gets easier to approach the point at which we can decommodify by taking out its worst aspects, right? By taming, by resisting, by escaping capitalism, to borrow Eric Olin Wright's conceptions of those terms for strategic logics of anti-capitalism, is that we can chip away at it. And when we chip away at it, we hollow out its power as a myth.
But unfortunately, these myths, these bad ideas propping up our continued allegiance to the market and to the role of commodities, the commodification of needs in our life is deeply felt and is violently adhered to across the globe. And whenever you see someone, you hear someone, you yourself are forwarding this acknowledgement of these needs as human rights, whether it's discourse about healthcare and healthcare as a right, or education as a right, or food or housing or shelter as a right, you inevitably will see all kinds of pushback from mostly bad faith actors objecting to this notion of any of these things being rights at all, unfortunately.
Well, they don't want to talk about it as rights because that would chip away at massive levels of their privilege and power, economically, culturally, sexually, all kinds of ways in which they enact their power. Because, I mean, there's a whole porn industry around women that can't pay their rent. You know, there's a whole like subgenre of porn where it's about women who can't pay their rent and so they have to use their body. We've seen articles again and again about how teachers don't have right to housing and they teach out of their cars and they work as sex workers. We are seeing how this is very much connected to conditions of privilege and inequity that exist. And so they don't want that rights framework because that would mean there's going to be a rebalancing of the books.
That would ruin the dogma that informs everything, the ideology that shapes their understanding of the world and their understanding of reality.
And because they have no creativity of purpose, they need those hierarchy fetish dolls to enact their own privilege and esteem because they can't be artists. They can't be creative thinkers. They can't live in imagined worlds of utopia because their fetish doll is their power and their hierarchy.
So I get extremely frustrated every time I see in social media provides the prime kind of platforms for this kind of bad faith action. You'll see an endless stream of these kinds of responses whenever someone prominent asserts something should be a right, that housing should be a right. So you'll see among them, there are all kinds of versions of these kinds of objections, but one will be this bad faith whining libertarian straw man again and again, which is this assertion that nothing that requires the labor of others can be a human right.
What about the coercion of the marketplace for people that already work in it? Where was my consent? I have to drink pee from a bottle at Amazon because I can't pee anywhere else when my bottle gets topped off.
I mean,
you got the image stuck in your head right now, Jesse, don't you? Huh?
I know, yeah. But it's just plainly idiotic and inconsistent with reality. I do think, though, this surface level, bad faith, libertarian position that will insist that rights can't involve labor, can't involve an exchange of reciprocity, only exchange of imposition and extraction.
One of the big problems is they think of labor as a neutral thing. It already is a power imposition. It's not, labor is not some neutral form of freedom. It's a power imposition on others.
It's clearly just a
bad faith argument.
It's just a bad faith argument, but also just pointing towards a central myth that is hierarchy is the natural order of things. And if you don't already have the thing, well, then fuck you. It's all dog eat dog. It's all competition. The very essence of being human is to compete against other humans and the rest of the planet.
It's cruelty at its most casual. It's like, dumb luck, dumb fuck. That's kind of like You've got your little piece, I got mine. And these are people that don't have capital to begin with that often make these claims, which I thought is they're not even capitalists.
No, they're not. But it's not surprising, though, because the degree to which obviously we are all socialized under this capitalist hegemony to grow an allegiance to the myths about home ownership, about wealth, about the American dream, that we, whether we like it or not, are in this bath, in this stew of indoctrination, wherein the fully indoctrinated ideal neoliberal subject, their motto is going to be, I got mine, fuck you.
Yeah. The viral infections infected their brain, and they're doing the work of the ruling class.
Then there's also, you already mentioned it before, but this always present refrain, this fallback to, well, how are we going to pay for it? Okay, well, if housing's a right, everybody deserves one. How are we going to pay for it? I think we'll get to that at the end, but you've already sort of addressed that a little bit. We tend to have to necessarily address that almost every conversation when we talk about these things. But it's just a total bad faith, horseshit, liberal hoodwink.
Well, because it's often said, yeah, it would be nice if we could do it. I said, well, let's just imagine we could do it.
Yeah.
Because you can get them to say, yeah, I don't want to really hurt anyone and have them sleep in a blanket and get raped in the middle of the night because they're a homeless woman. But, we just can't do it. Because if you said we could, but that's not the world we live in, it suggests that we could persuade them.
Yeah. Part of that persuasion may just be an acknowledgement that we have already the resources, the technology, the time, the energy, all the things we need to provide free housing to every person on the planet.
And that extends to the Golden Square. To the Golden Square. We already have a post-scarcity world.
Yes.
Now, that being said, climate collapse is incurring huge wrath points on our lives.
Yeah.
But right now, as we speak, if we had the transformation of a Green New Deal, we already have the current resources, if properly used, to have post-scarcity material needs met for food, shelter, healthcare, and education. And housing's just one of them.
Yeah, but it's not going to work with fucking billionaires. Can't have fucking billionaires.
And it's not going to work with the current set of politics. It's because we don't have the right politics.
Yeah.
That's why we're in this horribly pre-apocalyptic zone of despair.
Yeah. And so certainly in a world that's defining principle is I got mine, fuck you. Of course we can't have housing for all. But that's just fucking bullshit. The defining principle of the world we should be fighting for, of this world of the Golden Square, is a simple moral truth that we have a collective responsibility to provide each other, each and every one of us, with the material means to live dignified lives. If that is what's animating us and motivating us together, we can do it.
Yep.
It's just a matter of having the right politics. And this is obvious and necessary because you deserve the means to live a dignified life unconditionally because you're a fellow human being. For no other reason. There should be no liberal bullshit, means testing, hoops to jump through.
And there's already been so much intergenerational suffering of our ancestors across the globe that we don't need to extend it further.
No, we don't.
We already have enough material of films to make about what a dramatically crazy conflict, explosive societies of the world that we've lived in the past and even in the present. So we can move beyond those points.
There are a lot of stupid, idiotic, bad faith objections to assertions like this, assertions of reality like this, that housing is a human right. And one of those is typically some sort of version of what is everybody going to do? How are we going to get anything done if everybody just gets everything for free and you're just lazy, you just want a handout? Me. This refrain to an economic logic that assumes or that asserts that the only way to motivate people towards acts of responsibility are economic motivators, are the threat of scarcity, the threat of violence, the threat of being without. It betrays what is the real motivator behind these libertarian ideas, this imposition of hierarchy and acts of hoarding for one's own.
These people also cooperate in ways that they don't acknowledge in everyday experience.
Right.
But they can only think of like the steel cage of competition and market-based exploitation as the dominant aspect of our life. But, if you read David Graeber's classic essay on Are You an Anarchist? The answer might surprise you, is that we still only work in general, if we're lucky at least, 40 hours a week. That is not all of our lives. much of our lives are meaningfully felt through cooperation.
Yeah.
So the majority of our lives are in cooperation. We ignore those parts and assume that's not the real world, when the real world is actually a small part of our everyday life.
Yeah. Even still, there should be no conditions. There should be no criteria to meet that somebody has to do something to get these. No, every person unconditionally, universally deserves these things because you are a human being, fellow human being on this planet. So there should be no requirement to have a job, which, to be fair, we must acknowledge that when we put the job as a central arbiter of what we're able to do in the world, to cover the cost of living, to have a decent life, right, dependent on a job, that much of the time, those jobs are complete fucking bullshit. Either they're doing bullshit types of work that's unnecessary, or they're doing harmful types of work.
Extractivist, oil, petroleum-based work, which on the surface might be needed because that's the environment we live in for consumption, but it's done in such excess that it's a bullshit job.
Or they are doing the necessary work that others are failing to do, that the wealthy refuse to do for themselves. They're doing the necessary and urgent kind of care work for those who have outsourced the care work that they should be doing themselves.
Essential workers, right?
Yeah. So there should be no, criteria to have a job or do some sort of work in order to have a decent home. We should be motivated by our moral responsibility to cooperate as fellow human beings living frail lives on a fragile planet, and not by an economic imperative to compete with each other and to win at all costs, no matter the consequences. We have to acknowledge that there is no practical reason to force compulsory participation in the capitalist economy in order to meet basic needs or to live in dignity, comfort, and security. It's just not necessary.
When so many aspects of our lives are already involving cooperation.
Yeah.
Or the majority of our lives are in cooperation or displaying mutual aid.
This existing social order, this thing that has us staring into the abyss, forces all of us to be complicit, and to varying degrees, but forces complicity in this racial, cis-heteropatriarchal capitalist system under the threat of the violence of eviction. Think about what is the thing animating people to go to work. I want to keep a roof over my head. What is this sort of
It's a form of wage
phrase?
discipline. Much like being homeless. I mean, the homeless population, the unhoused population, is a form of wage discipline. And the idea of paying for a house is a form of wage discipline, which is why the HUD was created during the Great Depression. It was that if we could create home ownership, this is well before World War II, the end of World War II and suburban model, is that if we could create a home ownership and get debtors prison for workers, they'd be less likely to strike because they have to pay for their rent or their mortgage. And that's the example of how you are able to manufacture consent.
This is where I would highlight the parallel logic, the identical logic at play in both home mortgages and student loans as a form of social discipline to keep people from organizing for a better world. This is why these things were created, was to lock us in.
Oh, absolutely. It's the unhoused and the desire to constantly have to pay rent to live on this earth are two of the most primal ways in which social control is created in modern society. There's no doubt about it.
I think it's fair to say that our current social contract for our society is some version of pay rent or die. Fuck that social contract. We need a new social contract. So that's why I insist on the golden square is that new social contract.
It's like that great meme that popped up during 2011, which is, humans are the only animals on the earth that have to pay rent to live. Yeah. And that speaks to the general level of systemic coercion on the part of the ruling class to make us feel insecure about where we walk, where we sleep, where we put our clothes on, right? Take a shower. It's all contingency on the ruling class.
I've always had a hard time finding any meaningful discourse that engages in an in-depth way on housing decommodification because we don't live in a world where housing is decommodified to any meaningful degree. Quite the opposite. We're always in some form of a so-called housing crisis. So there are countless places to look to meditate on those crises, to see the shape and form of the problems around housing. And we'll probably leave in the show notes lots of links to places to learn more about the housing problem, as it were. But the story of housing is the story of capitalism's defining character. That is scarcity in the midst of plenty. We have enough. We have the technologies, we have the means, that there has ever been a problem. Housing has always been about politics, has always been about bad ideas. Therefore, I think it's kind of hard to use the word housing crisis because there's always a housing crisis. It's kind of a redundancy in our current social order to say housing crisis because it's always in a crisis. And housing will continue to always be in a crisis under capitalism.
And especially as the unhoused continue to be unhoused.
As long as housing is commodified, there's going to be a crisis.
Absolutely. We've never seen it not as a crisis.
Yeah.
It was a crisis even when it was affordable for white people, that white cis people, even when it was affordable for them. This is key. It's only considered a crisis when white people don't have access to it.
Yeah.
It's only a crisis when white people don't have a job. It's only a crisis when the people that are supposed to be buffered from the insecurity of global capitalism are protected. When they're not protected, then we call it a crisis in the media.
Yeah, only a crisis that the mainstream and the state will do anything about.
Exactly.
When it threatens the manufactured reality of those in power.
And this is once again as a debate to talk about this too, is that families of resemblance are closing the gap between white and black America. It's because white people are increasingly living lives that are closer to the subjugation that African Americans have always lived within the United States confines. So there are families of resemblance, but when it comes to mainstream media, they only seem to care when it happens to white people.
Yeah. But the very fact that housing is commodified to any degree is a crisis, and we should see it as a crisis. And we should therefore act accordingly to mitigate and reverse this crisis.
It's guaranteed to be systemic.
Yeah. Madden and Marcuse, in the book we've mentioned before, In Defense of Housing, say that ultimately the problem with making housing a commodity is that as such, living space will be distributed based on the ability to pay and provided to the extent that it produces a profit. But the ability to pay is unequal, while the need for a place to live is universal. There is thus an unavoidable contradiction.
That's a great quote.
And I really appreciate that because it points towards one of the core contradictions of capitalism, that is this commodification of needs.
And the way it incentivizes the wrong kind of principles, right? It incentivizes the wrong kinds of principles. Yeah. It's detached, decoupled from human rights, human needs.
So we must meet universal needs with universal and unconditional rights. There's lots to say about the so-called housing crisis, the housing problem, but recent numbers about this reality, at least in North America, to be aware of, I think, is that most recently, according to the Census Bureau, there are 15.6 million vacant housing units in the U.S. This doesn't count homes that are extra homes or vacation homes where the rich or ultra rich who own multiple homes. These are just vacant housing units. And they're estimated to be more than 500,000, more than 560,000 people without homes in the U.S.
As of 2019. Yeah.
As of 2019. These things are always estimates, but if we take these estimates of 500,000 folks who are unhoused and 15.5 million houses, this means that there are nearly 30 vacant homes for every unhoused person in the U.S.
And that's remarkable because the statistic back in 2011 was 1 out of every 6. Now it's 1 out of every 30.
Again, these are estimates, so you'll see estimates from 20 to 50 or something like that, homes for every unhoused person.
And that also has a lot to do with the uneven distribution of capitalism in the United States, where you have entirely gutted cities that are basically ghost towns, whereas some cities like where I'm at Riverside, rents moved up higher than anywhere in the United States, and you have housing scarcity that's literally for people that are living in those states. It deals with the irregularities of the housing, but also how jobs exist within different states to unequal levels.
This disparity, one, clearly is an indicator of this defining character, scarcity in the midst of plenty. There is plenty when it comes to housing, but we have manufactured scarcity. We have enough housing. This is what continues to baffle me too. Navigating the city, I always am amazed at all of the wide availability of the built environment, of all kinds of forms of architectural space. office space and warehouse space and industrial space and all kinds of other spaces that aren't just residential, many of which are used for bullshit jobs, for bullshit industries, for harmful types of work that could be repurposed into housing. So if we thought about all this extra office space that the managerial class has, Jesus Christ, that could be used for housing. We don't even have to even think about that. All of that surplus in the built environment, which is far more than enough to house
already
everyone
earmarked as home, already categorized as home. They're ready to go.
But just look at what's already categorized as housing. Just that small sliver of the built environment that is already housing, built for housing people, there's far more than enough. So we have plenty. It's just being hoarded as commodities for wealth and profit, for wealth accumulation. So ending houselessness, ending homelessness is always presented as a intractable kind of problem.
Complex. It's difficult.
Oh, it's such a big...
there's
no way.
I can't figure it out.
Fucking bullshit.
Yeah, absolutely bullshit. Shut up,
fucking
city council
bullshit.
member. Yeah.
Fucking bullshit.
Yeah.
Just give people homes. Just give people homes. Even if, okay, let's say even if we didn't expropriate homes from the wealthy and from landlords and just give them existing homes, even if we wanted to build new homes, we could do it. All we got to do is take the $10 billion that is spent to create one aircraft carrier, and you do that.
Jesus Christ.
There's enough, right?
So you're saying there's enough that we could house all of the unhoused right now in the U.S. for $10 billion, the price of an aircraft carrier.
The price of an aircraft carrier.
And we spend probably about $1.5 trillion on the military-industrial complex, if you include the Department of Energy and other cabinets that deal with the military-industrial complex. So just give it that slice of a slice.
Yeah. A whole sector of human activity that should not fucking exist. The military-industrial complex, none of that fucking shit should exist.
Yeah.
So not only is there an abundance of housing available to house people, and not only is being without access to housing a massive problem, the price of housing is also equally an absurd problem.
Yeah, Doug Henwood's Behind the News podcast talked about how I think rent has moved up 23% since 2015. And those rent prices are crazy. So like San Francisco's $2,600.
How much have wages increased?
Yes. Groceries have moved up 10% during the COVID crisis.
This is the line at which most liberal discourse will walk up to and then stop and not go any further, is the absurdity just in the inequality, in the growing inequality within the existing so-called social contract. This existing myth about the American dream that you get a good paying job and you be responsible and have your home, and then you can afford to have these basic markers of dignity. But people can't even do that anymore.
It's a basic contradiction because you have wealthy people hoarding their property and poor people cobble together. Really, it's a cobbling it together of wages to have some type of housing, because Los Angeles, California, as of April 2021, it's $1,960. New York, $2,480. San Francisco, as I mentioned earlier, is $2,600. Right?
Yeah, for one bedroom apartment.
Minimum wage workers, really at this point, we can move them up to $15 or even $25 an hour, but they'd still never afford to live in downtown Los Angeles.
Minimum wage workers currently cannot afford rent in any state in the U.S. So if you make minimum wage, work 40 hours a week, you cannot afford the median rents in any state in the U.S.
Yep.
And in terms of home purchasing, home buying, the median price for a home in the U.S. is currently somewhere around $350,000. But of course, those vary wildly. We were just looking at a story that in California, the median price is $750,000 plus. So,
and if you look at the numbers, the biggest inflation adjusters that creates poverty in America, the two reasons why people can't afford the cost of living, they go into debt, they lose their home, but they can't afford just minimum basics. It's because of the increasing costs of healthcare.
Should be free.
And it's the increasing costs of housing.
Should be free.
Should be free. And once again, elements of the golden square. But if the median sales price for a house right now in the U.S. is currently $350,000,
just fucking absurd.
What real purpose does rent or mortgage serve anyway, when it's already so incredibly unaffordable?
I like this as a little isolated thought room to walk into.
Thought experiment?
I don't even say it's thought. It's not really a thought experiment as much as
but a thought room. I like this. I've never heard
a little thought room to walk into, which is Imagine your house, your apartment. If you're fortunate enough to have a place to live, imagine that you just stopped paying rent, stopped paying the mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen? Would that house, that apartment care? What does it get from your rent? What does it get from your mortgage? It gets fucking nothing. It's already there. It exists.
Nothing happened. We saw this with the COVID. We saw this with COVID. I mean, this is what David Graeber talked about, was like all these things that we thought would, like the stock market would crash because there's all this unpaid mortgage and rent. Nothing happened. We just stayed at our home, which tells you that we can stay at home and work less and not have to worry about things, because the stock market didn't crash when millions of people couldn't pay rent.
As of now, the estimates are somewhere around over 10 million people in the US who are behind on rent, somewhere in the range of $5,500, $6,000.
Mm-hmm.
And eviction moratoriums will expire this summer in July.
Keeps getting kicked down the can by all the presidents.
Yeah. Eviction moratoriums just mean that landlords can't take their eviction cases to court. And that has been a continual struggle over the time of the pandemic. But if that moratorium is allowed to expire and there's no rent cancellation, and then there are millions of folks who are under threat of eviction come summer or fall, that will not be because there's a lack of housing. That will only be because we've prioritized the enforcement of this myth of social hierarchy, of this idea of housing as a commodity above all else, above its use value. Its exchange value is far more important than its use value.
Yeah, moral decisions are going to be made, and they're going to be immoral. That's part and parcel of what you get when you replicate the ruling class through its political apparatus, which we are participating in at the same time we have no faith in it.
Yeah. Even though some notion of housing as a right is a widely held understanding and has been for a long time. In the New Deal era, there may have been an opportunity to further move towards decommodification of housing for all. There has instead been a further ramping up towards hypercommodification of housing over the last 80, 90 years, and an undoing of this notion of the right to housing. And I think there's a lot we could talk about and look at that goes through these histories of how everything got so fucked up.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus. Yeah.
And this history of how everything got so fucked up has to do, of course, with race, has to do with discrimination, with practices of redlining and blockbusting, with segregation, with trends of shifting demographics in the urban and suburban areas, of white flight, of projects like master plan communities like Levittown in New York and in Pennsylvania that were designed specifically as white-only communities. Mm-hmm. There is a good recent documentary that goes over some of this still unfolding history of discrimination, segregation, and gentrification called Owned, A Tale of Two Americas. There's also a really great book by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor that goes in depth in the history of Black home ownership in the U.S. called Race for Profit, How Banks and Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Home Ownership, talking about the history of redlining and post-redlining, how the practices of discrimination and segregation played out through what she called predatory inclusion.
And she makes the case that the biggest reason for the inequities between whites and blacks in America are because of intergenerational wealth accrued from whites, from cheap houses that they were able to get, where African Americans were blocked out through different home loan practices, as well as the segregation of employment. And so she really makes the case that that's the demarcation of what creates inequity between blacks and whites is housing.
Yeah. I mean, home ownership is central to the American myth, the American dream. It is emblematic of the accumulation of wealth and the intergenerational transfer of wealth. And as she says, we have a society in which home ownership is the key to the good life, and African Americans have not had fair access to it. Also, gentrification, of course. There is a great book on this that's part of Jacobin's series with Verso called Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State, in which Samuel Stein shows how gentrification is a feature of capitalist urban planning.
There's a great interview on that, I think, with Doug Henwood's Behind the News.
Yeah. Gentrification is a sign that real estate growth, that housing as real estate instead of housing as home, is central or primary organizing principle behind urban planning.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. Investment in housing as a commodity in which to extract wealth from.
Wired into the foundation.
Wired into the whole thing. There's also recent neoliberal features of the commodification of housing that Madden and Marcuse talk about in their book, In Defense of Housing, where they outline 3 specific interconnected and mutually reinforcing factors that constitute the hyper-commodification of housing in the 21st century. Those are deregulation, financialization, and globalization. Deregulation being things we've heard a lot about recently since 2008, the predatory lending practices and the rewriting of mortgage regulations, the removal of rent control, the destruction of social housing we've talked about before, like Pruitt-Igoe and other iconic social housing projects in the U.S.
Just destroyed, dismantled.
Just destroyed, dismantled. The financialization of housing,
taking housing debt and cutting it up, which I think the Big Short, the movie and the book detail quite tremendously. Which is the cutting up of debt and putting into little pyramid schemes and having it float onto the ether of the stock markets.
And then globalization, investing in housing in all parts of the globe, not with the purpose of living there or inhabiting it, but just as investment and using shell corporations and LLCs and things like this too.
As we learned quite well from the Panama Papers, which turned into a Netflix film.
Yeah.
But definitely these shell companies exist to hide and hoard intergenerational wealth.
And they say that together, these interlocking processes of deregulation, financialization, and globalization have meant that housing functions as a commodity to a greater extent than ever before.
And why not? Because if someone tells you, and this is what Samuel Stein says in his book, Capital City, is that 50% of all of capitalism's valued assets are in land. So are in property. When the stock market is too overvalued, then you dump it into real estate. It's this backup place. And it's more than a backup place. It's a parallel world to the stock market.
So understanding these things, it helps to make clear how in the places where I live in so-called Vancouver right now, in British Columbia, previously lived many years in Los Angeles, and in both places, as in many major urban centers across the globe, we have what David Graeber calls batshit construction. There's just luxury apartment complexes being built all over the place, casting shadows on everywhere I am in the city right now. There's these massive projects of new luxury apartments. But understanding how these forces, deregulation, financialization, and globalization, we see that these are products of global capital accumulation and are not local investments in the community. How we have the construction of thousands and thousands of units of housing and continue to have thousands and thousands of unhoused neighbors in these cities is just a clear indicator that these are not being built for people to use, but for people to profit from.
It's science fiction parodies when you have the world's largest and most priciest home called The One. It's 105,000 square feet, Bel Air estate, and it sells for $350 million.
Yeah, this is an absurd property. That's this huge mansion estate in Bel Air that I think they initially wanted it to go for like $500 million or something, but now they've had to reduce the price down to like $350 million. There's also a whole litany of these real estate absurdities, one of which Madden Marcuse highlight in their book is this penthouse on Billionaires Row in 157, one of the skyscrapers on Billionaires Row in Manhattan overlooking Central Park, that in 2015 sold for over $100 million to an unnamed buyer. It was just to a limited liability corporation. So we see that these mega homes, these multi-million-dollar homes, are typically not purchased or sold as places for people to live.
They're like buying paintings, aren't they? They're like a speculative bubble for buying paintings or NFTs. They're just trading cards for people.
They are just trading cards. Madden Marcuse say 157 is not high-rise housing so much as global wealth congealed into tower form. We see these luxury real estate properties as safety deposit boxes for the ultra-rich. Because if it has market value, it doesn't matter whether or not it has use value.
It's a series of backup plans in case something falls apart. And the paranoia goes to extreme ends that if I'm rich this way, I can be rich in this other way in case that other rich way falls apart because of the stock market. That's why land is always there. It's because it's a backup plan for stock markets.
Yeah, it's just a place to park your wealth. It's not a place for you to rest. It's a place for your money to rest. Beyond the absurdities of these particular kind of luxury properties, there's also the absurdity of the hoarding of properties. So in the spectrum of the so-called ultra-rich, there is apparently, as of a few years ago, a new sort of bar to reach in this stratum of society to show that you have wealth, that you're part of this elite class. According to AIG Insurance, apparently the ultra rich or ultra high net worth, as they say, individuals in America now have 9 homes and 19 cars.
Jesus.
What on the fucking blue fucking marble is that shit? Who the
fuck? They got to keep this. They got to keep, America's growing economy growing,
That's not even counting properties that are just for an investment.
2 testicles are not enough for some people. You need 6 or 7.
Presumably, these ultra high net worth folks are ultra high net worth in part because of the real estate market and real estate speculation.
And rent extraction, let's not forget it. It's just the various ways in which rent extraction happens, whether having someone pay for their subway, that they're, mini-me wealthy person, or these apartment complexes they own that can use permanent rent extraction from.
Either way, it's just an absurdity that should be unconscionable. This should just, I stammer through these conversations because it's just so gross and so kind of unbelievable that we are living in a world that the conditions are this absurd. It's just mind-boggling. And it's just a level of inequality that it's hard to comprehend. But for sure, this crisis is a complete and utter catastrophe.
It just is. It's just this social bomb that keeps going off every 3 years. But for other people, it's a permanent feature of their life. They're permanently scarred and traumatized, right? Yeah. We talk about the separation of children from their mothers during the Trump era. And also this was something that had occurred in all kinds of abusive ways in the Obama administration with the rape and molestation of children. But the cruelties and inequities of that separation can be seen by the housed and the unhoused, right? Is the trauma of losing a home, trauma of not having a home, of perpetually feeling afraid when you go to sleep.
Because of all of these reasons, I think it is fair to say when looking at all of the factors of our shared conditions, staring into the abyss, that if we're going to pivot away from sinking into oblivion, if we're going to save the planet and save humanity, that the problems around housing are make or break. Housing is a make or break issue of our time. And free housing for all is perhaps the most urgent and necessary revolutionary demand we can make. It points to the most central part of the system of global financialized capitalism and is a key material component in each of our lives and a necessity to create the conditions for freedom.
It's a metaphor for how we treat the earth, right? I mean, the rape of the earth, the penetrations of its resources, the vast inequities of who gets what from the earth's biopower. We can see this in terms of the scarcity of housing, who does or doesn't give housing, how it's produced, and the ethics behind it. It's a very much a mirror world of our relationship with nature.
And housing is the terminal commodity of post-industrial capitalist society. It is the commodity of commodities. It's the commodity that we strive for in life.
The American dream is the single resident home. I mean, that's the first object, not the car, not the marriage, not the children. It's the goddamn house.
Yep. It plays a pivotal, central role in our shared conceptions, shared stories about life. And it's the most expensive commodity that anyone strives for in their lives, typically.
If you attempt to buy a house like I am right now currently, you will do more paperwork in the escrow process than you will ever do to put a child into a public school or to file paperwork for their birth. I mean, even death doesn't require that much paperwork. It's the most expensive and sophisticated commodity on the face of the earth.
In socialist discourse, in Marxist discourse, it's always this primacy around work. And, we could spend forever talking about why that's rightly so and so forth. But when it comes down to it, we have to put housing over work. What are we working for anyways, right?
Exactly.
Why are we fighting for increased minimum wage, for living wages? Why would we be demanding basic income or a jobs guarantee, if not to enable more of us to afford housing?
Yes, absolutely. This will blow your mind, but in Austria, where Red Vienna lives and exists and continuously now to this day, in 1924, people spent 4% for housing in Red Vienna. 4% of their wages were for housing. I can't imagine anywhere. I mean, even people with mortgages don't pay 4% for their house. So Red Vienna is an example of how we could imagine where our wages don't even really go to housing.
Right.
I mean, because even if you own a house, you still have property taxes to pay, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's astonishing to think of the ways in which, when it comes to wages and it comes to healthcare, housing takes up the most amount of cost for anyone, even healthcare. Because most people, generally speaking, unless they're elderly or middle-aged, are not spending a lot of money on healthcare. It's housing that eats up the most of a worker's paycheck.
Yeah.
So if we really want to liberate workers, maybe our orientation towards housing might be more central and the kind of focus for building the Golden Square.
What is a quicker way to create conditions for a dignified life? Giving people more cash so that they can pass that on to landlords, or just giving them the fucking house?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes,
Just give us our fucking homes.
Give us the right to buy it. Yep, give us the right to buy it.
In the book, In Defense of Housing, Madden and Marcuse say that if housing for all is a commonly held ideal that is impossible under current conditions, the best response is to hold on to the ideal and change current conditions towards realizing a world that more closely resembles it. The way to do this, they say, is to formulate demands that are accomplishable in the world as it exists, but which point in the direction of deeper change. The right to housing should not be rejected as an unrealizable fantasy, but upheld as an object of struggle towards making it a reality. This is where it gets really difficult. How exactly?
Well, yeah, because we're told to work hard in our lives and succeed, but if we work hard on social problems, we're told it's unrealizable. Well, let's just work hard on this as if we'd work hard on our jobs as a collective activity.
We could spend a long time debating strategy and how exactly transformation should, could, might happen. But generally, how might we organize for this kind of transformation to get us closer towards the decommodification of housing? Noting that in our next conversation, we'll spend more time on what some of those specific types of transformations might look like.
And how we categorize them.
How we would get from here to full decommodification, what those different projects might look like. But how do we organize for those projects that would push us towards fuller decommodification?
Many of these things are not tied together. And I think that's what we're going to do in our next episode, is not only just rank the political viability, but also the effectiveness and the rate at which they can be linked up into a kind of chorus of liberation.
Yeah.
Because we have to get all of these trains linked up to go on the train track.
Yeah.
And right now we have people hopping over each train track, pointing at a different train that's got missing cargo.
Yeah.
And we got to get them all linked up. And so I think it's something we're going to look at. So certainly I would say the biggest alternative and the biggest mobilizing effort would be for something like a community land trust. Certainly social housing would be great. If we had Bernie Sanders elected as president, that would be a new political horizon. But community land trusts become increasingly more resonant as a way of organizing for transformation because they create permanent civic engagement.
Yeah.
If they're done right, if they're done from below, socialism from below, they create new democratic actors who have been disconnected, dispassionate, and alienated from the subjecthood of their citizenship in the city they're living in. So it's one possible thing. Certainly one thing that Madden and Marcuse talk about is taxing vacant buildings, basically tax them into the ground so they're used for the public good. So those are all kinds of things for transformation that we can think about.
We'll spend some time going through a list, an incomplete list of some of these projects that could potentially, to lesser and greater degrees, get us towards decommodification, the goal of decommodification. But a key part of engaging in that struggle is organizing for that struggle. How do we create the collective power?
Mass movement.
To move those demands forward. And I think, obviously, this is the kind of work that is about mass movement building. These are the kinds of transformational aims that require a complete social transformation.
It's a location of solidarity. And the thing with housing is people can see in very visceral, graphic, physical ways how their change has been positive when they see it happen just a block away.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think what's important, first off, out of the gate to think about or to recognize in thinking about how do we get from here to there is to understand that this requires a mass mobilization. This requires a mass multiracial democratic movement.
Supermajority support. And this is why when we talk about housing, we have to include all the other hierarchies that are encased in our society in grotesque ways. So the rights of women, the rights of folks of color, the rights of LGBT and trans folks, that when we do housing, we include all these other types of suffering and we work to erase those sufferings as part of a prefigurative politics.
And to create cultural change so that we create a new understanding of common sense. That we create a new common understanding of how the world works, that we make it politically impossible to not make free housing for all a human right, that we make it a cultural imperative that free housing for all is a no-brainer, that it's obvious and necessary, and this is what we're going to do together. What are the ways we can engage and organize together to fight for these demands? There are a few things that come to mind. One is tenants unions, there's debtors unions, there's workplace union organizing, there's general socialist organizing, like through organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America and so forth. But I do think that there's a lot of untapped potential in the coming together of these disparate locations of organizing work. That in the 21st century, there is a solidarity triple threat that is yet to meet up, which is the combination of debt organizing, housing organizing, and work organizing for debt strikes, rent strikes, work strikes, and building towards
and working within socialist organizing in terms of like chapter units for DSA. Almost every chapter in DSA that I've seen to and run into, they all have a housing working group. Creating those seeds are important so that people can work on projects that they're passionate about. So there's different projects within Socialist Horizon, especially in DSA, which I think is going to be a formidable and powerful force as part of that project to create an institution outside of unions. Because there are no unions. I mean, unions have been decimated. I think it's 3% of the U.S. population are in some type of union. So we have to create these parallel institutions that operate outside of the wash-on, wash-off of electoral politics. That being said, certainly looking at ways to create and get money out of politics is another thing we want to think about. Democratize the election and get private money out of local politics, because land developers typically control zoning rights and who gets to sell what to whom. And that's something we have to look at. So we have to democratize the state, and we can do that on the local level, not just the national level.
Whether it seems self-evident or not, part of the demands that get us towards housing decommodification will include democratizing the space of electoral politics, like you were saying, electing socialist candidates.
Or having politicians say they will not take money from land developers.
Right.
Just take an oath. So there's a city council member running right now in our area that's basically said, I'm not taking any money from the police. He's running as a socialist in Riverside, a very purple city in the Inland Empire of Southern California. So that's something we could ask.
What that points to is taxation, creating conditions where it's realistic to pass legislation to tax the rich. You don't need 9 homes and 19 cars. You don't need a $350 million estate. People are unhoused. We need to house them. We need to house everybody.
You're part of the problem. Your fucking ass is on the hose,
Yeah.
We don't want to deny you the golden square, but you are eating up everybody else's golden square, motherfuckers.
Yes, we need to expropriate wealth that's being hoarded from the rich. We need to expropriate their wealth. And their wealth is largely in real estate.
Yes.
We need to tax those assets. It's important to understand that taxes aren't what create funds for other things. We don't need taxes to fund anything. So yes, you might have proposals for legislation from folks like Bernie Sanders who will say, well, we'll pay for this by a tax on the rich. And that helps it maybe sell politically or gain traction politically. But the fact remains that the function of taxes in the economy is to protect against inequality. And that's what we should fucking use them for.
Exactly. And there's things that we need to be spending, right? For the Green New Deal, we need to bare minimum be spending $10 trillion in over 10 years. That's what all the climate scientists say. And Biden's $2 trillion. So you're going to have to spend money first. And you can tax to control inflation, supposedly. This is what claims are made. But also that taxation is not really the principal reason for why the government exists, right? And so we can imagine that we have needs that need to be met in the climate horizon that we have. And they're not negotiable. 10 trillion is not negotiable.
Yeah.
If you want a living planet, that's just something you have to create.
Yes. And certainly in the US and in Canada and other places in the imperial core with stable sovereign currencies, the way that the currencies circulate means that localities like states and provinces rely on the recirculation of funds through taxation as a primary way to fund local services. So it's important that, given that that's the reality, that we do things like defund the fucking police so that we can fund investments in communities on the local level. But on the broader scale, on the scale of the economy, it's important to understand that that's not how money is created. It isn't created from taxing mom and pop. It isn't from your taxes. I don't fucking need your taxes. We need taxes to limit hoarding by the wealthy.
Yes, exactly.
All of these things together, right? In other words, is we need to follow the axes of what we called before the anti-capitalist compass. In this push towards decommodification of housing, we need to eliminate state violence. We need to work towards guaranteeing social welfare, towards decommodifying life, and towards democratizing society. Because ultimately, the so-called housing crisis is a crisis of capitalism. So this has to be an overtly anti-capitalist project. This housing crisis is a crisis of racial, cis, hetero, patriarchal capitalism. And the aim of free housing for all is an abolitionist aim. It is a feminist aim. It is a clearly anti-capitalist aim. Because a vision of a world with free housing for all is a vision of a world without landlords, police, or the patriarchy.
And the aim for free housing should involve, and it cannot be separated from, this parts of emancipatory struggle, of the fights for economic, racial, and gender justice, and the fight to prevent climate catastrophe are all intertwined in this.
Yeah.
We cannot separate them.
Therefore, everything must change, because the project create decommodified housing for all is a project to create an entirely new society. And the Golden Square, which includes, again, just as a part of that within this expansive term shelter, which includes free housing for all, is the foundation, one potential foundation on which this new society can be built. And this has to happen, and it has to happen now, because capitalism must end or humanity will.
And on that light note, bring out the drum roll and the dancers. It's called Blazing Asses for a reason. My ass is burnt by capitalism. But it is eco-socialism or extinction. It is democracy or death. It is utopia or Bolivian. The phrase by Rosa Luxemburg that it's socialism or barbarism is true because of climate change. It was never about a binary before, but it is now because of climate change. We are sitting in a binary.
And to be clear, providing housing as a right, fully decommodified to everyone, does not necessitate more of this capitalist mode of carbon extraction and destruction of the biosphere. Just use what we have. Fix what we have, make what we have greener, right? We work towards making it less carbon intensive by making it last, by making it be a place to use by humans to do the necessary work of social reproduction, and not just as places to park wealth.
Absolutely.
All right. I was really trying to avoid getting into ranting and railing, mode. That's
your promise you've been making for 2 years. So
I just can't help it. At the end, I get so riled up.
Well, thank goodness we split this into 2 episodes.
There's so much more to say. There's so much more to say.
It is.
And I don't know how to communicate effectively and clearly enough how totally, utterly, absolutely fucking unacceptable housing as a commodity is. how we fucking how the fuck do you sleep at night?
How do we sublimate it? Yeah, it's how do we sublimate it? Yeah.
How do you fucking sleep at night?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Turning this thing that is a human fucking need into a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
What the actual fuck?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. It's like the This Is Hell podcast is like, yeah, well, by all counts.
And I'm just supposed to fucking find a way to cope, just fucking get on with it.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I supposed to just fucking get on with it? Why is anyone supposed to just fucking get on with it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Some people are fortunate enough to have circumstances through the luck of birth or
generational,
whatever, to have the issue of housing resolved in a stable way so that ownership is locked in, so that
it's white noise for them.
So the cost is wiped away. But that is such a tiny percentage of people.
It's white noise.
And that is white noise. And that's not a solution.
Yeah,
and that's not a solution.
A kid in Dallas freezing to death because their heating didn't work because of the jet stream collapsing is an example of the kind of white noise that exists.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your patience again, my comrade, in going through these structured conversations where there's
heart-rending, but it has to be talked about.
It has to be fucking talked about. Thanks for talking with me, and till the next one.
Cheers.
Cheers.